Hi everyone, welcome to a book discussion on The War on Tenure by Deepa Das Acevedo. This book was published by Cambridge University Press in 2025, and I would like to thank Deepa for agreeing to this discussion. Let me very quickly introduce the author and the speaker to our audience. Deepa Das Acevedo is a legal anthropologist and associate professor of law at Emory University. She is the editor-in-chief of the peer-reviewed journal Political and Legal Anthropology Review, a past trustee of the Law and Society Association, and has served in leadership roles across multiple professional associations. Deepa's research brings interdisciplinary insights to the study of employment regulation and workplace dynamics in academia. Her book, The War on Tenure, was named one of Forbes' top 10 books in higher education for 2025 and has been featured in podcasts and op-eds at several venues. Additionally, Deepa has a long-standing research interest in India. Her first monograph, The Battle for Sabrimala, Religion, Law, and Gender in Contemporary India, was published by Oxford University Press in 2024, and her research on religion-state relations in India and temple governance in Kerala has been published in, among many others, Economic and Political Weekly, Law and Social Inquiry, the American Journal of Comparative Law, and Modern Asian Studies. Deepa and her co-author Deepika Kinhal are currently working on the Judicial System of India, a book under contract with Oxford University Press. I very warmly welcome you to Doing Sociology, Deepa, and thank you for accepting our invitation to connect.
Thank you so much for this conversational opportunity, Ruptaparna. I'm very grateful to be here.
Your book primarily touches upon an area which doesn't receive a lot of attention when it comes to academic inquiry. Now, in this book, you look at tenure as an employment protection and you sort of reconceptualize it. What theoretical interventions do you think this reframing in legal scholarship and higher education studies make?
I think that I have been surprised in the course of doing this research by just how much conversations on academic employment and faculty tenure in particular have been one note. We have focused only on defending tenure insofar as it makes academic freedom, free inquiry, pedagogical freedom possible. And I completely sympathize with that orientation. I don't disagree with it, but I think that this has made it difficult, if not impossible, for academics to explain their own workplaces, to explain their profession and their industry to people in the general labor force, to citizens, to taxpayers, to parents and students and politicians in ways that might resonate with them. Because after all, academic freedom is something that's very particular to our industry and profession, whereas job security and career progression and thresholds to enter the profession of your choice, these are things that a lot of people can sympathize with. And I think that talking in terms of workplace dynamics and employment regulation makes it possible for us to build bridges in ways that higher education everywhere, definitely in the United States, but I think not only in the United States, really needs to do right now.
Thank you for that. That's a very interesting way to respond. So your analysis throughout the book, it draws on a lot of materials, legal doctrines, labor market data, media accounts, and personal narratives. So how did you design a methodological framework which could integrate these diverse sources of evidence?
I didn't design a framework. The materials and the framework as such just sort of it formed itself as I conducted the research. So when I began this project, it was during the height of COVID. It was in 2020. I was sitting at home, not teaching classes because I was actually on a research leave anyway. So I would have ideally been in India doing field work, but I was sitting at home and writing instead. And during my breaks from writing, I did what was completely not productive in retrospect and probably not the best idea, but I was reading all of these terrible stories that were coming out in the academic trade press, publications like the Chronicle of Higher Education or Inside Higher Ed, sometimes even the mainstream press, the New York Times, the Washington Post. And all of these news outlets were talking about the shutting down of departments, of committees, sub-department units that hire faculty and give diplomas or certificates or degrees, sometimes even of entire institutions. And, I started thinking to myself, well, most of these faculty who are affected by the layoffs and the shutdowns, they are not going to be tenure stream faculty. They're going to be what in the US and Canada is generally called non-tenure track NTT faculty, which means that they might be employed anywhere from a one term or one course basis up to a couple of years at a time, 2 year, 3 year, 5 year contracts. So a majority of the faculty who were affected by these layoffs might have been NTT faculty, but at least some of them were tenure track or tenured professors. And as I kept reading these kind of doom and gloom stories, I wondered to myself, well, what happens if you're tenured and you're fired? How often do people get fired despite having the protections of tenure? Because if there's one thing that you hear, especially from mainstream society in a way that is critical of academia and of tenure, it's that tenure gives you a job for life. It is a permanent job. I know that's not true. I knew that it wasn't true even then, but I did wonder, well, what happens when all of these tenured faculty lose their jobs? And so I assumed that, higher education is a huge field, especially in the United States. So I assumed that there was some kind of empirical data on how often tenured faculty lose their jobs, either because they're accused of having done something wrong that warrants overcoming tenure, or because, like in the 2020 examples, their institutions or their departments were just shutting down and there was no more job for them. So I looked around a little bit, excuse me, and I was searching for empirical data in the higher ed field, and there just really wasn't anything on tenure stream faculty employment and especially tenure terminations. So then I thought, well, how hard can it be to collect this data? That was definitely over confidence on my part. Part of the reason that this data hadn't really been assembled is because it turns out it's very difficult to assemble and nobody tracks this information from a governmental perspective. But I started thinking about how to answer this question that I started with, which is how often do tenured faculty lose their jobs despite having tenure? And the methodology really kind of grew out from there. I realized that I was asking a quantitative question, so it wasn't something that I could answer using my usual anthropological methods. I mean, as a sociocultural anthropologist, what I normally do is conduct fieldwork, right? I go situate myself in an environment for an extended period of time. I observe, I participate, maybe I do semi-structured interviews. I've occasionally dabbled in surveys, but never very seriously. And I realized that answering the question that was interesting to me wouldn't be possible if I only relied on my usual sociocultural anthropology methods. I had to build a data set. I had to engage in quantitative empirical work. And that was a big project, partly because it is hard to collect this information, but partly also because I wasn't trained in any of those methods. And I say in the book, and I say whenever I'm asked about the methods behind the book, that I wouldn't have been able to do this project if it wasn't for my mother. She is a business scholar by training. She's a marketing and consumer behavior scholar. But most importantly, she is a quantitatively, statistically trained person who also found the project interesting and was willing to help me. So she basically taught me how to do the work that I needed to do to answer that question, and that I myself didn't come with the skill set that was necessary.
Thank you again. A very honest and interesting response, and also acknowledging your mother and the positionality that you had. You characterize academia as an industry and professors as workers. This is a very interesting lens to me because it has been missing from discussions on academia. And as a fellow enthusiast of studying the academy, this is something that I took from your book as well. What kind of analytical work does this language do, and how does it intervene in debates about academic exceptionalism?
Yeah, I mean, it's a small thing, but it's, I think, a very important part of what the book is doing and what I want to achieve with the book. Um, I I teach employment law. Most of my daily work when I get up and go to campus, tomorrow I'm teaching an introductory course on employment law, and then I teach another class on employee benefits. So I think about people as workers. Most of us are, unless you're kind of uh, you've inherited wealth. You need to work for a living. And the question is, in what industry, with what credentials, under what conditions, under what regulatory framework, right? Academics are exceptionally averse to being characterized as workers. I do not see that language in any of the news coverage, really in any of the higher ed scholarship that I've read. And again, I'm not a higher education scholar by training, but I have kind of adopted the field a little bit over the last few years out of necessity. And that framing, that orientation that academics are workers who are interested in preserving and improving the terms and conditions of their work, who are affected by the legal frameworks that apply to their workplace and their jobs, that's just missing in the literature, in the conversation. And I think my very intentional use of words like worker and industry is meant to be directed at both academics ourselves and at a broader non-academic audience. And it's kind of achieving the same thing in both directions, which is to tell both academics and non-academics, hey, we are workers. We do this job, yes, because we find it interesting and meaningful, and we're passionate about either, our areas of research or teaching the next generation or both of those things, but it's still work. We are still getting up and going to the office to perform a job under certain conditions. We are evaluated. We have career aspirations. We are regulated as employees or not. And both academics and non-academics need to remember that, because I think otherwise it's very easy to forget or to overlook the fact that all of the mundane considerations that apply, that academics are perfectly willing to admit apply to accountants or attorneys. I mean, I train attorneys, right? We teach classes about lawyer employment regulations, but we don't talk about ourselves in the same language. I think it's very easy to forget that all of these concerns also matter for academics, and there is nothing wrong in that fact. I think there's a great deal of shame in academia about considering ourselves to be workers who have interests in maintaining a functional and productive workplace, who want good conditions of work. And I don't think that shame is warranted at all. So that's really what I'm trying to achieve internally by using that language. And externally, I'm trying to kind of moderate the conversation that happens outside of the university context by saying, hey, yes, Uh, you don't need a PhD to do a lot of different types of jobs outside academia, so that makes us a little bit unusual. In the United States, you don't have much job security in a lot of types of jobs, so that also makes us a little bit unusual. But academics, nonetheless, are usual workers and they care about many of the same things. They're subject to many of the same forces. So if we think about universities and colleges and academics in that lens, I think non-academics also would find it easier to relate to some of the concerns that are coming from inside the university.
Right, and thank you. I think this makes a lot of sense in terms of what you describe of academics looking at themselves and the labor that we do. You also talk about structural cost of doctoral training and doing postdoctoral research. How do these sort of fit into the broader argument about tenure's value as an employment protection?
Yeah. Um, so most of the book is about what happens after you get a tenure stream job, because that's really where I found that there was a, a lack of employment-based and legally informed analysis. But the book starts with a discussion of what it takes to get into a tenured stream position. And as you were saying, Rituparna, what it takes these days in many different country contexts is, and many disciplines, is a PhD, which takes long years of little to no pay, and depending on the national context, certainly in the United States, for most people, it takes a lot of educational debt to get that threshold credential. And then it takes many years of postdoctoral training where, again, you're working long hours, moving cities, universities, flats, and being paid very low rates for the most part. So I talk about all of these kind of barriers to entry and threshold credentials in order to uh, put into perspective what it takes to even be eligible to play the game, to enter the industry. And I think that those entry requirements, those eligibility requirements, this isn't about guaranteeing that you get the job. It's not about guaranteeing that you get a good version of the job. This is about just becoming qualified to potentially hold the job. And all of those requirements are really underappreciated in mainstream society. And I think that, when we talk about other elite professions, I compare academia to the legal profession and to the medical profession repeatedly throughout the book, partly because it is easy for me to make those comparisons and the necessary information was relatively easy to find. But I think also because in a lot of places, among a lot of people, doctors, lawyers, professors kind of occupy a similar rung of the general imaginary when it comes to types of workers, right? We're all highly elite, highly credentialed, and the assumption is highly paid professionals. And what I'm trying to do by talking about all of these barriers to entry and stuff is to say that yes, lawyers and doctors, at least in the United States, do also incur a lot of costs. And those costs are both monetary and in terms of opportunity costs. They do incur a lot of costs on their route to becoming eligible to enter their chosen professions. And it's also true that lawyers and doctors, for the most part, do not have similar levels of job security through the law as professors. But what is equally true is that a lawyer or a doctor at the kind of institution that I have always worked at, I've trained at, many professors who are successful at getting tenure stream jobs in the United States have trained at or teach at, that people who come out with other similar elite professional credentials in the United States uh, earn a heck of a lot more money. And so even if you incur the same costs, you are able to compensate for that in what you get if you enter your chosen field. And the odds of entering your chosen field are infinitely higher. So if academics also have to incur a lot of threshold costs, monetary and otherwise, but the odds of being able to enter the field for which they have incurred those costs are very low, somewhere between 10 to 25%, depending on the statistic you rely on. And then even if you have that best case outcome, you earn very little, not enough to account for all of the educational debt or lost income or lost savings that you've incurred. You need something to help make academia make sense as a career choice. And that thing, the only thing really, is job security. So tenure helps make sense of all of those threshold costs that extend beyond getting your doctoral degree, in part because nothing else does for academics the way that it can for similarly elite professions.
Right. So, there are a lot of claims about tenure distorting academic, competency, instead facilitating complacency. So, how do you respond to that, through your research?
Yeah, so this was when I started the book, like I mentioned, I started with this question, how often do tenured faculty get fired despite having tenure? But as I went on in my research, I realized that that question was very interesting to me, and I knew it would be interesting to a few others. But equally, what most people, especially outside academia, wanted to talk about is all of the things that make academics different, that make academia different and maybe a little suspicious or nerve-wracking, right? And so I knew that for this book to do the kind of work, both with respect to academics and with respect to kind of mainstream readers outside academia, that I wanted it to do, I would have to consider a lot of the commonly held stereotypes or assumptions that I know exist out there that I think you and I both encounter. A lot of these assumptions transcend country context, and the specifics of how you are trained or professionalized or enter into academia that may differ between, the United States and other countries. Um, and what I do is I take 3 to 4, depending on how you look at it, but definitely 3 of the most common stereotypical criticisms that I hear about academics, and consider whether there's any empirical justification for them. The first of these is that getting the job security of tenure uh, facilitates, if not encourages, professors who have tenure to become ideological renegades. This is particularly in the US a really hot topic now, and it always has been that essentially once tenure allows professors to indoctrinate their students to pursue um, un uncredible and unworthwhile research avenues, to spout all kinds of claims, to pursue their own political agenda, and so on, right? Tenure facilitates a kind of ideological renegadism. That's the first major assumption. The second one that I encounter a lot, that I'm sure you also have encountered, is that tenure facilitates laziness. This is basically an assumption born of a kind of classical economic rational maximizer theory of human nature. If you have job security, why would you keep working hard? Because we only work hard to achieve job security, right? So if tenure gives professors job security, well, why would they bother getting up in the morning and trying to write the next article or the next book? Why would they bother improving their classroom teaching methods? Why wouldn't they just give everyone, an A or 100% and call it a day, right? That's the second major assumption, that giving professors job security in the form of tenure leads them to become unproductive, however you define productivity. And then the final major assumption that I hear a lot, this comes in waves, but it surfaced quite uh, clearly and I think more prominently during the height of the Me Too movement in the US, because it kind of the the understanding that gender dynamics in many industries had led to massive and underappreciated levels of sexual misconduct, abuse, and harassment didn't leave academia untouched. So this third assumption is that tenure, because again, it provides job security, and job security gives you a degree of protection, right? This assumption is that tenure encourages predatorial behavior or simply bad behavior, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be of a sexual nature. It doesn't have to do necessarily with sexual misconduct. It might be there is a version of this criticism that suggests, well, tenure encourages unethical behavior. Maybe if you have job security in the form of tenure, you're more willing to cut corners in your research, to engage in lazy or sloppy research to the point of plagiarism or copyright infringement or something like that, right? But put together, all three of these criticisms begin from the assumption that giving workers job security incentivizes them to behave in socially undesirable ways, that they wouldn't behave in those ways if they were a little afraid for their jobs, if they didn't feel secure in their jobs. And what I do in the book is I dedicate one chapter to each of these main criticisms. And I show how both the empirical research that we have, the quantitative empirical research that we have, the experience of not only academics, but of people who watch or engage with academics. For instance, professional coaches in academia who work with faculty, right, to help them achieve their career goals. And as well, just the mechanics and internal dynamics of how academia works as a industry, as a workplace, who makes decisions, the conditions under which they make those decisions. All of these things fundamentally show that the assumptions are not warranted, that tenure does not, either there is no proof that tenure has these incentive distorting effects, or there is proof that tenure does not have these incentive distorting effects. It's either the absence of proof or the presence of counter proof. And my hope is that by acknowledging these criticisms, which I think are born of reasonable lack of familiarity and at least common, if not necessarily reasonable instincts about how human incentives, respond to the environments around them. By taking seriously these concerns and these assumptions and showing how they're not warranted, I'll be able to meet critics of academia and tenure kind of where they're at and say, I understand your worries. They're not entirely unreasonable, but here's why they're not warranted.
Right. Last question. What future research directions do you see, for scholars who might be examining the political economy of higher education? Or have we exhausted all the questions?
No, I think I'll answer this one quickly, but I think that there is so much potential for taking academia more seriously as a workplace that is both similar to and different from other workplaces. And doing that while accounting for either country specific or discipline specific or institutional type specific variations. Your own work is really a great example of this. And I mean, I reached out to you because I think, to my knowledge, you're the only person I know of who's done similar work in the Indian context, who's taken Indian academia seriously as a professional environment, and kind of discussed the dynamics and the constraints that inform that environment in a way that I find deeply appealing, but that I think we're just beginning to do. And hopefully, the more of that is done, the more both academics internally and observers and critics of academia externally will be able to have productive conversations about how to structure this field that I think we both believe deeply in.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you. I hope your last words resonate with more researchers. And thank you for this wonderful conversation around your book. I'm sure that our audience will benefit from it. So I would like to thank you again for taking the time out despite the time zone constraints, etc., and doing this for doing sociology.
No, not at all. Thank you so much for this opportunity to speak with you. It was wonderful. And I really enjoy the series. I've had a chance to watch several of Doing Sociology's episodes. It's a really fantastic project that you've got going with the Brenna. So thank you for this opportunity to join you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah.